Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Barnaby's is one of the leading search engines for art, design, antiques and collectibles from over 3,000 auction houses worldwide. We aim to make the art and auction market more transparent and accessible to everyone, from beginners to collectors and professionals. Welcome to today's episode of Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Today we meet Stephen Eisenstein, rare book dealer and radio program host. I would like to start to ask you, Stephen, when and why did you fall in love with antique books?
It was an accident, to be honest about it, Pontus. I had two friends in New York that were my mentors. We're still friends today. We are always talking to each other on a daily basis almost. They had a rare book business in a bookstore in New York in a place called Hempstead, Long Island. The store was a 3-story bookstore, which they rented a room in where they had their rare books. The lady who owned the business was named Elida Rushfarg, who was one of the bigger players in New York books at that time. As a matter of fact, she's the one who coined the phrase, rarer than the rare book is oftentimes the buyer for it, but we'll go into that later. So they had this business. I'd be in and out of town as I would be in and out of town visiting family in college and, such. And we talk shop and they would tell me, well, we bought this book for 25 cents and we can sell it for 300 or we can sell it for $20. It depends on what they found. Well, one day they needed a partner for the day. So they said, Steve, you are here. You go with Jimmy and drive him around to garage sales and estate sales. And on Harvey is the other guy. He was going to go drive himself. Okay. So we went to this estate sale in our hometown by coincidence for $5. Now remember, this is money. $5 for a book at a garage sale in 1968 was a lot of money. Jimmy said, we're buying this book. It was called The Old Fire Laddies of New York in Brooklyn. We paid the $5 for it. When we got back to the store, by coincidence, a fire department buff was there, paid $75 for the book. And I was impressed. I said, wow, you really can make money. Because I used to laugh at it. I said, you mean people actually buying these crusty old books? And then I realized that it was something that in several lifetimes, I saw this right away, you couldn't master it. So they started teaching me, the vocabulary, the tricks of the trade, what to look for, the whole mentoring process. But I emphasize, I've been doing this for 54 years, and I don't know half of 1% of what there is to know. It's unmasterable. But how I got into it was kind of through osmosis and almost by accident. But as I say, I recognized what it was. And from there, it just built and built and built and built. And I'll tell you, the best thing I ever found at a garage sale was my wife. Okay. We met at a garage sale. So that's how it started, Pontus. It was kind of by accident. Nobody ever grows up and says, hey, I want to be a rare book dealer today. I haven't met anybody like that yet. But it's a wonderful business. It's you're a jack of all trades, and sometimes you get to be a master of a few.
I can imagine. But how old is a book to be considered antique?
Well, okay. Now, the word antique, there are certain words like antique, rare, first edition, and we'll cover some of those later. But there is, what is an antique firearm? An antique firearm is something before 1898 using American, standards in that particular area. An antique book, there's no, age, let me say it this way, it's probably make more sense. Age has nothing, zero, zip, nada, nish, nick, nine to do with the value of a book. Age has nothing to do with it. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. 1999 publication, J.K. Rowling's, $461,000 is the record at auction. Go back 1925, The Great Gatsby. And let's do a little teaching in this Great Gatsby example. It's my favorite example of modern first edition fiction. If you have a copy of The Great Gatsby in a fine copy in a dust jacket, you got a book you could easily get 175, 200 grand for. I think in April of 2014, the finest copy known to man sold at an auction for $377,000. But when it comes to fiction, in a book like The Great Gatsby, a lot of people don't understand this. 95% of the dollar value of that book is in the dust jacket. My fantasy has always been to go to an estate sale where somebody's grandfather worked for a company like Scribner's in the dust jacket printing department and put away 2 or 3 copies of each dust jacket ever made between the 20s and 30s. The dust jacket, if I had a dust jacket for the Gatsby in fine condition, I could easily get 150 grand for it. If I had the book in super fine, just the book in super fine condition, it would be hard to get 7 to 10,000 for it. So age has nothing to do with the value of a book. And an antique book, 100 years old, it's kind of an acceptable definition. But, some groups might say we want anything printed in Germany before 1929 but there's not, antique is kind of a misused word like the word first edition.
But what other parameters are you looking at as a collector?
Well, as a collector, first off, I've always collected reference books, but I have always been a dealer more than a collector. So are you asking me like what kind of topics, what kind of things are people looking for today that are desirable topics?
I guess it's the condition of the book, of course. But as you said, you were mentioning the first edition. Is that how important is that, for example, for a collector? And
okay, let's use that word first edition, and I always like to add humor to, learning. I made up a word years ago. I call it first editionitis. It's a disease that young book collectors and dealers get. It's the overwhelming urge to buy anything with the word first edition. And that word first edition is so misunderstood. By example, there's a word called points in the book collecting, book selling market. Points are things that identify one edition from a later edition. Like in the case of The Great Gatsby, let's use that book as an example. If you had a copy of The Great Gatsby, what you would have to do to find out that you actually had the true first edition of the book is this. You would start with the dust jacket. The dust jacket on that book has a point. So an example of a point in one book in a book on page 5, line 6, the first word, a spelling mistake was made. The correction of that spelling mistake identifies the second edition, and the book with the mistake in it identifies the first edition. So let's talk about The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, some books have no points. Some books have multiple points that have to line up. So if you have The Great Gatsby, what you would want to do is this. You'd want to look at the book. The first state includes the following points. On page 60, line 16, chatter versus a spelling mistake that was made. Echoliala is the mistake they made. On page 119, line 22, it should be northern versus southern. Page 205, line 9 and 10, that's one of the famous points in this book. sick and tired versus sick and tired. And there's about 8 other, individual things, including which way the author is facing on the back of the dust jacket. So just because a book says it's a first edition doesn't mean it is. Just because a book is a first edition doesn't mean it's collectible. If you want to use the word first edition and apply it to collectible books, you would have to have authors of a collectible, household word authors: Dickens, Bronte, Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck. I can go on forever on that list. But those are the first editions that people are looking for. And when it comes to fiction, the first edition is an important word, but it's also a very misused word. When it comes to nonfiction, you can have a book, let's say it was a book on birds. So the first edition of the book was published in 1840, and it had black and white illustrations and, was a nice looking book. But in the second edition, they decided to make it a large folio edition, and they put in chromolithograph plates, and it's a gorgeous book. So, the word first edition is often misused. When it comes to fiction, it's got to be the right author, the right title. Generally speaking, you want the earlier editions of the books in that author's career, or some of the ones that might be highlights, like James Joyce. James Joyce has great books throughout his career, but obviously, Ulysses was, later in his career, but, one of the most epic novels ever written. As a matter of fact, let me add a little humor to that. A.S.W. Rosenbach was a very famous bookseller, probably the most famous bookseller of all times. James Joyce, the writer, wrote Ulysses. So, of course, Rosenbach represented people like the Rockefellers, the Huntingtons, anybody that was rich and built a library back then. Rosenbach was the buyer for it. So they're at an auction. Rosenbach and Joyce are at an auction. And what are they both bidding on? They're bidding on Joyce's manuscript copy of Ulysses. How it wound up there is another story, but, Joyce was a starving author, and, Rosenbach had, the deepest pockets in the world backing him. So obviously he won. The next day in a Boston newspaper, James Joyce wrote this poem about Rosenbach. Rosy Brook, he bought a book, though he didn't know how to spell it. Such is the lure of literature for the lad who can buy and sell it. So that's a quick discussion with a little poetry and humor about first editions. The dust jacket is everything, and condition. Everything, the only thing that allows anything to be sold in an inferior condition is extreme rarity. Years ago, a copy of Tamerlane by Edgar Allan Poe showed up at a farmer's auction, bound in between, a couple of books. It was bound into a book with pamphlets in it. It sold for $169,000, but it wasn't in great condition. Can you imagine what it would have went for in, other conditions? So first edition, you've got to learn the publishers' names, who the reprint houses. A lot of times we're asked, I found this edition of Cinderella or Alice in Wonderland. I found an Alice in Wonderland. Well, if you don't have the original red cloth first edition with the points in it, and you get an 1890s edition by some reprint house, you need to know the names of reprint houses. You need to know the names of the, normal, regular publishers and so on. Fiction is tricky. I am not a reader of fiction. I have learned this stuff kind of by rote. And if you want to know the two best things that anybody can do to enhance their book knowledge, it is read online dealer catalogs, because now they're free. Back in the day, we used to have to pay and subscribe for them. And the other thing is, wherever you are in the world, if there's an antiquarian book fair in your area, go to it as a patron. Just go walk around, meet people. And if you have book dealing in your future, and that's what you want to do, it's one of the best things you can do is just, go in and do an antiquarian book fair. It's a great way to grow your client lists and things like that.
So it sounds like in general in this business of antiques, and I mean that's the way you do it, right? You need to feel and touch and talk to people, and that's how you learn, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you can go to the Colorado, it's now in Michigan, I think, book schools, or you can go to Virginia and take a couple of courses. But, you really just have to immerse yourself in the self-study of it. And the materials out there. We used to have to subscribe to everything. Remember, I'm 72, so back in the day, everything is done now by computer. You have a book, you list it online. 20 seconds later, somebody responds, here's the money, it's in your bank, you mail them the book, and it's all done. Back in the day, it was a whole different process in the pre-computer days. You guys don't know how lucky you are. If you ever hear those stories about Grandpa had to walk 12 miles in the snow barefooted, well, it's kind of like that the way it was. There was a magazine called the Antiquarian Bookman's Weekly. If you want, I can find a copy of it. It's usually right near me. But what we had to do back in the day to sell books was write out postcards describing the book in professional terminology. The Antiquarian Bookman's Weekly listed, I used to call it the dramatic reading of a telephone book because it looked like a telephone book, but instead of numbers and names, it was authors and titles. And you didn't have computers to know what you had in inventory. You had to remember it or have it on index cards. Wrote out a postcard. The guy who wanted that book could have gotten anywhere from 0 to a couple of hundred postcards. You may or may not get a check for the book. You had to hold it. You couldn't sell it, for a couple of weeks, because if the check came and you didn't have the book, it killed your reputation. It took 4 to 6 weeks to do what we do in 24 hours now, back in the older days. So
you are celebrating online behavior and internet, I guess, then?
When you say celebrating, I would not have anything to do with Facebook or online if it wasn't for the rare book business in my radio program. But I got to tell you, it's phenomenal. There's a group. 3 years ago, I took over a group that had 5,000 people in it. It's called Vintage, Rare, and Antique Books. We are now up to 36,000 people, 4 other administrators besides myself that I brought in. And online is amazing. I mean, Pontus, valuemystuff.com. Who would have ever thought of that? In pre-computer days? Maybe there was some kind of, send us your Kodak photo or your, Polaroid photo or something, and we would do it. But, it's phenomenal. I will also say it's a double-edged sword, but, it's just phenomenal what the computer has done for all of our businesses per se.
But back to the bookshelf.
Yes.
What would you say is the most common mistake you make when clearing out an estate and getting to the library? I mean, I see so many people that just throw away everything.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. First of all, people should plan. If you're spending your lifetime collecting something, take a few minutes to leave some notes for your heirs. But, when you say, what are they collecting? You're going to estate sales. Let me answer your question, but with a little indirect approach to it. You're going to an estate sale. I guess what you're saying is, what are people looking for when you go out book hunting, or, me as a book dealer or anybody else in the business? When we go to estate sales, what are we looking for? What type of books? Is that the question?
Yeah, you can say that.
Okay.
Or also the opposite around. I mean, the ones that inherited. What should they do with the collection or library?
Oh, okay. All right. Let me build into that one. If you have a house full of books that you inherited, and of the every month, at least 150 of the 1,000 people who apply every month to become members of Vintage Rare and Antique Books inherited something. Over the last 4 years, 3 of them have gotten into the book business because of what they inherited. A woman in Georgia buys a property. On the property is a cottage that they didn't care about, and they knew what was there. What are we going to do with it? They go open it up. There's 20,000 books in it. It was a time capsule. This woman had a mail order book business back in the pre-computer days. Died, frozen. That was so. Okay. What do you do? How do you approach valuing your books, whether you inherited them, whether you have a book on your home library shelf, the family story associated with a book that was passed down for generations? Generally speaking, those are BS. It's not BS per se, but it's the family story is 9 out of 8 times usually wrong. Okay, house full of books. There's 2 ways to reference books. Auction prices, which is what I as an appraiser would prefer to use, and dealer listing prices. So where do you get dealer listing prices? Via Libre, Adol, Abe, Biblio, all of those sites that are fairly well known. Those are dealer prices. What you have to know when you look at those dealer prices is what is the reputation of the dealer. Now, if they belong to an association, like I belong to FABA, Florida Antiquarian Book Dealers Association. What does that mean? It means that a group of book dealers vetted me. I have proven, that I know what I'm doing in the business. So if they have letters after their names, it means they've gone through a vetting process. So if you're going to get prices from lists of dealer prices, it's better to take the prices from an informed dealer. But on the other end of it, if this informed dealer is one of the top dealers in the country, they have something you don't have, and that's called a client list. So don't expect to get the same price they do. But let's go further. You look up a book, and let's say, for argument's sake, the value of that book is $200. And let's say, for the sake of discussion, there's 30 copies, 30 different examples of that book in different conditions, different prices were listed. Somebody has it priced at $1,200, somebody has it priced at $5, and everybody else has it priced between, $175 and $200. There's a pattern there. Look for those. The other question is, did the dealer sell the book at that price? By chance, if there were only a few dealers, did you pick the dealer who knew what they were doing? And then the other one is this. I'm a dealer. If I bought that book from another dealer, and let's say it was a $200 book, or for a better example, let's say it was a $10,000 book, I get a 20% dealer discount, so that means that book sold for $8,000 if it's sold at all. That's what you do. You go to these sites like Adol, Via Libre, things like that, and you look up your books and you find out what they're worth. The auction prices, I always say this, there's a site called rarebookhub.com. It's a subscription service, but if you walked into, for me as an appraiser, it's mandatory that I have this, material at my fingertips. As somebody like listening in the audience right now that's listening to this podcast, you inherited a room full of really nice antiquarian books. You walk into the room and you're looking at a library that looks like the Ninth Gate. I'm joking, when I say that, but you know what I'm talking about. Baron and Baroness somebody's, library. That's what you're walking into. You would have to subscribe to the rarebookhub.com for access to the auction records. You can get the subscriptions by the year or by the month, but if you walked into that kind of situation, you have to get auction prices. It's something. Now, what about subjects? Okay, what kind of books are we looking for? Let's talk about fiction briefly because we already discussed it. You're looking for the finest first editions of the authors that people are collecting from, the 1700s up to the modern authors. But in fiction, that's what you're looking for. Dust jackets came into existence around the 1820s. From the 1820s on up to the 1870s. 80s, they were very scarce, usually kind of plain brown wrapper things. By 1900, everything had a dust jacket. But now let's go back to what are we looking for in nonfiction, okay? Nonfiction is the bread and butter. The more obscure, the more bizarre, the better. While age has nothing to do with value, as I said earlier, sometimes, dependent on the subject, it does. So, in nonfiction, let me give you what I call, I could do this in my sleep, this little list of stuff. I love to do it. Okay. Breaking it down into categories. Art, architecture, and photography books. All right. Now, I'm not saying that books like The Art of the World or the stuff in the Louvre or, Louvre, whatever,
Yeah.
that museum, MoMA,
Paris,
whatever.
yeah.
I'm not saying those, but yeah, those books aren't saleable. They are, they're $15 to $30, $40 books most of the time, but that's not what we're looking for. We're talking about looking for the good stuff now. Art, architecture, and photography. What makes a good art book? What makes a good art book are words like this in the title. Catalogue raisonné, the complete works of. This book contains 6 lithographs by Marc Chagall. Art magazines, Derrière Le Miroir, Verve, 20th Century Cycling. And one of my favorites, who remembers carbon paper? Those little boxes the carbon paper came in. Picture a gorgeously printed carbon paper sized box. And the magazine is Aspen Magazine. I call it the art magazine in a box. The Andy Warhol issue of the 10 issues they did, the Andy Warhol issue is the 3rd one. If you were lucky enough to find it with all 10 items, artistic type items, newspaper, Velvet Underground wax record, goofy stuff from the 60s. A dealer I know had a copy of it years ago where Andy Warhol signed all 10 pieces. Today, it would probably be $100,000. Back then, it was 20. If you just had the regular edition with the 10 items in the box, you could be going up to $2,000, dependent on the condition. So, art. The more specific, the better. The older master artists, yeah, they're looking for their catalog raisonnés, but most of the money in art books is in the modern art books. Stuff with lithographs, chromolithographs, poussoir plates, name it. The more specific, the better. And, so you want an art book on a specific artist. The same thing holds true in photography and architecture. In architecture, you want, things like Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Nuri, and all those other guys. Photography, same thing. You want a monograph, a singular book about a singular photographer, architect, artist. In photography books, you don't want the works of all the photographers. You want works by individual photographers: Ansel Adams, Henry Cartier-Bresson, Steichen, Strand, Weston. Find Bresson's Decisive Moments or Cartier-Bresson's Paris or Aget, any of those major photographers of that time period. And I'll give you a clue when you go to estate sales. Now, I know estate sales are more an American gringo thing, as they say, than they are overseas. But if you go to an estate sale and you find one of these photography books, and in the book it's signed by the photographer, and it says, in this book we've laid in, there's supposed to be an original photograph, but someone took the photograph out of the book. Look around the house. Might be in a frame somewhere. Okay, other subjects: art, architecture, photography, hunting, fishing, firearms, archery, big game and exotic places, whether it's fishing or hunting. You find stuff from the 1890s earlier up to the 20s, 30s, 40s on big game and exotic places by famous people, that were hunters of the time. Phenomenal books. You can find books on the history of specific firearms companies. You don't want the guns of the world. You don't want the fish of the world. You don't want hunting around the world. You want singular themed books on those subjects. Military history. It's a hell of a way to talk about wars, but let me talk about military history books in the terms of what's collectible by war. American Revolution, earlier wars, very collectible. Most of those books by nature are going to be older, earlier, harder to find. Moving fast forward, 1814, moving fast forward up to the more major wars, you get into the Civil War, probably the most collected war of all wars. Anything published during the Civil War or just after it is usually the most desirable. There's two words that you should add to your vocabulary: regimentals and unit histories. What are they? A regimental in the Civil War is the history of a specific fighting group, the 104th Infantry from Tennessee or the Pennsylvania Volunteers. As it got into World War II, and it became the 203rd Bombardment Group, those became unit histories rather than regimentals. But when you find the histories in a book of a specific fighting group from the Civil War, World War I, World War II, going forward, those are very collectible books. Those are not to be confused with the graduation books from all the forts and military colleges that happen every 6 months or so. The only thing that makes those, like high school yearbooks, very collectible above the average is who went to those high schools or who graduated from that military class. Find the Thomas Jefferson High School book from Corpus Christi, 1950 something. Find the right one. Janis Joplin and Jimmy Johnson, the football coach, both were walking around the halls of Thomas Jefferson High School the same year. That's why that's like $1,000 high school yearbook, and yours and mine ain't worth anything. Okay. Atlases, fine press books, travel transportation, children's books, series books, illustrated books. Once you start getting into children's illustrated books and you start talking about, Pyle Pogani, Dulac Parish, Rackham Wyeth, those books are very collectible. History of almost any kind, the more specific, the better. Regional history. You talk about Americana, cowboys, Indians, East, West, North, South. It goes on and on and on. Books on book collecting. Pick a subject. There are books written about it and people collecting it.
But, according also to one of the latest Barnaby's report, the interest for antique books have increased the last few years. But why now, you think?
Wait, say that again. You mean the values of books have gone up?
Well, both, maybe the value, but also the interest seems to increase quite a lot.
The interest, yes.
Yeah.
Talking about interest. Okay. We do a book fair every year. We used to do 15, 20 book fairs every year, but, as they said in Desiderata, surrender gracefully to the years, the book fairs of youth. What can I tell you? In answer to the interest, it's there, Pontus. It's there in an amazing way. We have 3,000 people that come to our book fair in St. Petersburg, Florida. 20% of those over the last couple of years have been new, younger people, and they are interested in every aspect. I had one kid was talking to my wife. He wants to buy any book that's been banned. Another guy comes up, I want to get into bookbinding and restoration. Another one. First, it's very encouraging as to what is going on with the younger generation and their interest. And surprisingly to me, because I don't have the patience to be a bookbinder. I have the patience of a saint most of the time. But if I had to do repetitive stitching all the time, I couldn't do it, So when I see these kids that want to get into the repair and the technicalities involved and, what kind of headband do you want to sew on? It's just amazing. Now, when you talk about value, let's talk about this, because this was one of the, questions that when we were pre-showing, doing some of our pre-show stuff, is books as investments. So I will tell you that books, in the book world, it is taboo. It's sacrilege. It's never been done to sell books as collectible investments. Although, if you track the book like The Great Gatsby, it probably outperformed most of the blue chips, but it's never been done. But that's not to say that books haven't appreciated. I will tell you, in nonfiction, dependent on what, it's generally a safer bet. I have a couple of books in my house right now. Signed and scribed Henry Miller. I have a signed, what was his name who did The Gospel Singer? Why can't I think of his name? Famous author, The Gospel Singer. I have a signed and scribed first edition in a fine dust jacket with a typed letter signed, talking about the very beginning of this writer's career and how hard it was, and can you get me a job in the Dade County school systems and all that. If I had that book 2 years after it was published, I'd probably get 4 times what I'm asking for it today, 30 years later. Fiction is fickle. Fiction can really go up and down. There are books that were, by Galsworthy, back in the 30s. Some of his limited editions was selling back then for what would have been $2,000-3,000 in today's dollars, but you can't get $25 for something like that today. Authors go in and out of vogue. And books should never be bought as a collectible investment, or touted as such. The 1 or 2 people that ever got it to a point where they were doing it, I think one of them failed miserably, and the other one is in jail, I think, something else that you were asking, and that is, what goes on in the appraiser's mind? How do you approach evaluation? I call it my appraisal dance of comparables. What you're looking for, what is it that you're looking for when you do an appraisal? If it's easy, you're going to find comparables, and that's going to be the justification of your price. Sometimes you always can't find a direct comparable, and your experience then guides you, but the thing has always got to be based in some kind of, factual comparison. If I make a statement that says this collection cannot be reproduced today, and therefore the sum total of the parts, we are adding value because, something can't be duplicated today. That's a safe statement, but that's how it works. Can you honestly say that? Because if you can't honestly say it, and you get challenged in a court case with it, you're going to have a fiduciary, liability. So, it's a very technical process coming up with it, whether we're doing, a simple 1 or 2 book evaluation, or whether, we're doing, hundreds of books in a major collection, the process is somewhat the same.
Stephen, you're such a great storyteller, but I am afraid we have to stop. But I need to ask you, when will you write your own book?
Never. I get sued. I don't know. It depends. Are we talking about me, the book dealer, or me, the entertainment director?
Well, that's a good question. It's up to you.
Thank you. No, I don't have a novel in my heart. The closest I've written hundreds of articles and questions and answer columns, but my wife says I don't blow my own horn enough. But if I was gonna write a novel, it was gonna be how I went to the first intergalactic book fair and Scotty beamed my books there.
Yeah.
No, short story maybe, but thank you for the encouragement on that, Pontus. And thank you for having me on your team.
No, it was fantastic. Thank you so much for today, Stephen.
Thank you.
To keep up with the latest trends and receive weekly updates on the art and auction world, subscribe to our newsletter on barnabys.com or read Barnabys magazine online.